recently I had the opportunity to chat with fellow IB educators around the world, talking about the constraints of transdisciplinary learning during this pandemic and how we as educators can advocate for inquiry and for conceptual learning even during these most uncertain times. So take a peek at a wonderful fireside chat about transdisciplinary learning, and we hope it helps you with your upcoming year. So what were you saying, Bodo?
I was just thinking, to Anne's point, just that idea of perhaps how do we leverage the enhanced PYP with how we're allowed to plan and how we're allowed to look at units more creatively than we have in the past. Whereas, we have 6 to 8 week units in the past, which really, narrowed our focus and only allowed us to do a certain amount of potential content, but maybe blowing up our current POI and how we're looking at our transdisciplinary themes and our overall time limits on things and all of that. Just kind of thinking outside the box of that. And there's some really great stuff going on right now around the world, like just thinking differently about the transdisciplinary themes and how those work within units and, outside of units. So I think that's an interesting way to go about it. It's scary though, but for some.
I think at this point, responding to what you were saying, Lou, I think at this point, it's about, taking a deep breath and being realistic as well. Because if teachers are being, asked or required to do certain things, then you have to take a deep breath and say, don't panic, don't get stressed and overwhelmed with it. Look at what it is that you're being required to do, and then say, okay, but now, how can I shift that? And so, while I agree, like usually I'd say I would always start with concepts, like in a situation like this, I might actually go to the ATL because it's easier to make a connection there. Because when I look at the ATL, and I don't know if you've seen Suzanne Keto's work, Orenji Buta, but like some of the statements that she's got there, they're like super easy to get into. And if you're, it doesn't really matter what you're doing if you're addressing a thinking skill, or if you're addressing a communication skill, or if you're addressing a research skill, because you can ask the kids to say, okay, let's look at this particular skill, and how are we using that across these different subject areas and these different experiences. And that in itself is also transdisciplinary. I mean, they used to be called the transdisciplinary skills, and that was for a reason.
The other thing that I might push people towards is the IB has some resources of partially completed planners on the Program Resource Center, and they are centered around the learner profile. And so they have central ideas that get at understanding that are linked, to the profile or through the approaches to learning or whatever. And so perhaps looking at those and rethinking, their current units and such like that from such a perspective might help.
What do you think are, for those that are struggling with going towards more of a transdisciplinary approach, what do you think are some of the benefits during this time? Whether it's a virtual or a hybrid or in-person experience, what would be the benefits, do you think, for a teacher to try a transdisciplinary approach? And what do you think might be some of the challenges?
I think the challenge, go ahead, Brandon.
I was thinking an advantage is, we're talking about kind of looking at what's most important for our kids to know and understand, right? And so being conceptual allows us to do that to a greater extent and allow those connections across disciplines, which then conceivably, if done well, would limit the amount of other things you had to pack into the curriculum. It would allow you to go into more depth versus trying to get every single one of these things completed in a disparate way, in a very siloed activity or worksheet. You can do it all together and hopefully hit a lot of those within one learning engagement versus all those worksheets that we have to pump out, or all those activities that we have to complete. So that, I mean, I think in the broad theoretical sense, that seems like the greatest benefit to thinking transdisciplinarily.
Yeah, and I think to build off that, that idea of the significant, engaging, relevant, and challenging curriculum, that how it's described in the PYP documents, would be helpful. How is what you're designing significant, getting at the main concepts that are transferable, that are important at this point? How are we keeping this engaging by bringing in the inquiry? How are we making it relevant to today's world, to this, and then challenging? How are we starting with where the kid is and moving them forward from there? And so if you think of everything you're designing, how does it fit each one of those things? I think that could be a helpful tool theoretically to frame.
So what have you guys been doing in regards to supporting? Most of us are still working with teachers within schools. If we're out of schools, what do you think has been most useful for teachers in regards to managing this climate of virtual learning?
Ours, it was the ability to think flexibly about what was possible, and to be able to shift the units in terms of looking at what was actually available to the children. But what I'm not sure of is if they're being told that they have certain things to cover, what's the best way to try and make connections between those? So if you're having to look at something through a new lens and it's not your own lens, it's almost like the first step is almost to calm your brain down, and then to look at it and ask yourself, like, what connections do I see between these things that I'm being asked to do? So sometimes, when you talk about, I think Bodo just said it about, being in silos and having things separately, sometimes you have to put those things together and see where they match up, So I remember doing this with PE teachers in particular, and they had to they almost have to cut up everything, and then they can start to see where the matches are. And if you're able to look at where you can pull out connections between the things that you're being asked to do, rather than seeing them as separate entities, that might be a starting point.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, I was just thinking that kind of really brings me back to, I think teachers get in those silos anyway, whether you're online or not, where you've been given, here's the mandated curriculum you have to teach, and they need help. Usually teachers need help understanding those connections, Kristen, as you were saying. And those connections, I think, really is when you start to think, even if you're thinking about key concept connections, or the maybe, I don't want to say simpler concepts, but the idea that there are ways in which you connect the curriculum. I think teachers overthink it sometimes. And I think if we kind of back them up a little bit and say, okay, in math, you're doing these things, and what you're doing is actually function. And in reading, you're doing these things. And look, here's function again. So having them to help even use the key concepts to cross over. Then once they get that, then they can start to look at those bigger related concepts, and say, oh, look, we're actually talking about balance in PE, and balance in science, and balance in math. So, okay, here's that bigger concept for us. And it may be while we're doing this that, and I don't know how schools feel about this, but maybe not worrying so much about that unit of inquiry that I have to teach, but rather how do I continue to teach in an IB way fashion? And maybe because the district has handed me these 10 points or these things I have to do, and they have nothing to do with units that I normally teach. Okay, breathe, like you said, Kristen, let that go. But still, can we connect on a key concept basis on using the ATLs, those elements of the PYP that still keep it coming forward? And I think then we also, as teachers, as administrators, as consultants, as friends, continually to say, let's use the language. Let's use the language with the kids. Let's use the language with ourselves. Let's use the language with the teachers that we're working with, so that it's continuously modeled. I don't know. That's just my thinking.
Right. And you know what you said about function as well, like about the concepts, like connecting those to processes can be helpful. So, you know, if you are looking at function, saying what is it you're looking at? Are you looking at sequencing? Well, then how is it sequencing in math? How is it sequencing in language? How is it sequencing in science? Right. And so just like what processes are supporting those concepts can help you to see the connections between those subjects areas. And you know, I always remember the classic one for me was when I was teaching art, and I'd say to kids, okay, we're using our observational skills and we're going to observe and record, and they'd say, oh, we're doing that in science just now. Oh, we're doing that in PE just now. And they'd make those connections. So sometimes it's about agreeing with your team as well that you're going to reiterate this language to help the children themselves make the connections between all these different things that are happening.
Yeah, I think one of the, I don't know, the practical ways to think about this too is how that idea of transdisciplinarity looks different from a connection to an experience to a unit. And perhaps as they're teaching, they're making some transdisciplinary connections between different content and concepts and such that they're teaching. But some of what they're designing might be a more transdisciplinary experience, like a STEM activity or a STEAM or a project-based experience or service, you know, or anything like that. And then we have what we, you know, generally have our units of inquiry being transdisciplinary there. And so if you can't fully integrate, teach this unit, this transdisciplinary unit in that way, then how can you at least build some transdisciplinary experiences, and how can you make transdisciplinary connections across your day, and being okay with that, you know, and that you're, you know, that again, that SEL piece of you're not a failure just because you can't implement this the way you've always implemented it. You've managed to make these other pieces.
I think you've really hit it on the head there, Chad, of like not beating ourselves up, that we're doing the best we can in this unique circumstance that we've never faced before. And, you know, many schools are still facing it, you know. How about in regards to the decisions by your governance or whatever, in regards to how long are you going to be going virtual?
Yeah, so for our school, we decided to start virtually with the teachers in the schools and the students at home, and it is an every 2 week at the board meeting, they will reassess what the stats are within the county, and then do then it's about a 2 to 3 week determination of a start date from there, because we're still going to give families the option of remaining virtual or coming into face to face. And by then determining how many come face to face, we have to create scheduling at the secondary level, especially at the high school, for those. So it's a whole different, there's a schedule for virtual learning, and then there's a schedule for what face to face learning will look like based on the number of students that choose that.
Because that's going to impact this work, right? As we're constantly flipping and flopping. And so I know a lot of teachers are fearful that they're going to continue as they are having to pivot how instruction is delivered, that every time they pivot, they're going to lose something in regards to this transdisciplinary nature. Yeah. So that's one thing that I'm really thinking about as I'm going into this school year. You have any last tips that you would give teachers to kind of root them so that they don't get bogged down by all of this change and transition? Anyone?
Well, I think, you know, coming back to basics and remembering the time of the year that we are starting the year, the focus first of all has to be on what we normally focus on at the beginning of the year, which is establishing our relationships and establishing the way in which the ways of working, if you like, how the classroom community, however the classroom community is going to work, that has to be established. That has to be number one. So that in itself, although it may be a different environment, is a familiar way of starting the year. And I think that if we slowed everything down a little bit and focused on that and use the children's input as to how they think things will work, then I think it just releases a little bit time and space of getting things working before you start jumping in and starting worrying about units at this particular point in time.
Okay. How about you
I
both?
agree. I often think, while I believe teachers are superheroes, they don't have to be superheroes. You know, like, there is this kind of like going back to basics, but not like worksheets and things like that. Definitely, because I'm thinking in two hats. One, what does it look like in the classroom when the kids come back, socially distanced? And then what does it look like virtually when we start? So how do we make that transition as seamless as possible? And I constantly go back to one quote. I think it was Lynn mentioned Kukaru, who said, how movable is your classroom? And that may not have been her quote, but like, how movable is your playground, but also how movable is your classroom? Where can you take your classroom? How can we take what we've been doing and realizing that learning environments are all around us? They're at home, they're outside, they're in the trees, and we all know this, you know, but not everyone does, you know, like, and how can we, you know, I'm in downtown Portland, our school, and we have very few outdoor spaces, but we found about 10 outdoor classrooms that we're going to repurpose, like little hills and all these different places where we can think outside and say, okay, what does this math lesson look like in nature? What is this, you know, how are we looking at science and nature? And, you know, how are we taking our units and adapting it to our environments that we're currently in? Because our kids need to get out, they need to socialize. And then what does socialization look like? And then this is the perfect time for student agency, as you were talking about, Kirsten. And it's something that we really need to foster more, right? So like, it's something that is ripe for the picking right now. This is the time where agency can thrive, particularly at home, particularly in the class, socially distanced classroom. So finding ways to support that is something that we're working on. I've got a lot of questions. I have really high hopes for the future, but you know, we'll see how we roll it out. But I think that's something that we can all start thinking about is, what does this look like somewhere else? What does this lesson look like in a different environment? So, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I like that.
That's
Well, and I think for many of our students who are living in poverty, and some have excellent internet and some have no internet and some have some internet, and we have buses going out into our city with Wi-Fi spots for an hour and a half. I think we have to, you know, help teachers understand that it's not going to be all lovely and pretty and Pinterest perfect, right? That it's going to be somewhat of a messy kind of situation, and none of us have any control over that. But to give them some options to help their kids think about, okay, if we're talking about, you know, whatever, here's some different things to think about that you could inquire about. So it might have to be some more structured, guided inquiry as we help those students start to move into more of that student agency and stuff. I think we just can't say, okay, poof, go do inquiry about, you know, whatever, when kids may not have the ability, resources, or knowledge about how to even go about doing that. And so I think, again, we have, like you guys said before, I think we have to tell the teachers, relax. It's going to be okay. Don't beat yourself up. You know, and think about maybe even helping the teachers understand different types and forms of inquiry. Because what Lou and I found in the last class that we taught is they didn't have a clue what that even meant. They didn't know that there were even different forms of inquiry. They didn't have that concept of understanding at all. And they were new to all this, but they had totally misconceptions of what that was. And I think helping them understand that students are going to be in different situations, families are in different situations. You know, we have families that, you know, there might be 3 devices in their home, but 5 kids all trying to get on at the same time.
Right.
You know,
Right.
what you can do.
But then I think if you do some work on inquiry processes, then whether or not you have a device, you can still follow the process. You can still connect as well to the concept. You can still connect to the to the critical thinking skill. So it's like if you're looking at, let's say, noticing or wondering, being curious. So how do we demonstrate? How do we put out hooks to demonstrate curiosity, and how do we set them up with? Yes, there's some online resources that you can use, like Wonderopolis, to just be curious. But when you're out for a walk with your family, or when you're playing a game, or when you're reading a book, like what else could you be curious about? So, so if you like, if the teachers unpack some of the processes with them and think about how they could apply those, and then take that in, particularly with the older children, into some of the visible thinking skills routines, which can transition. It doesn't matter which book you're reading. It doesn't matter which picture you're looking at. You can do a see, think, wonder. You can do a think, puzzle, explore. You can do a connect, extend, challenge. It doesn't matter what you have. And also, I think somebody already said it about how can you design something that incorporates all that you need. So, for example, if you're looking at measurement, or if you're looking at giving instructions, what might you be able to design that allows that flexibility? And ask the children, here's all the things that we need to do. What could you investigate and show me that you were able to do that? We did something similar with a grade 3 class last semester, and they decided that they were going to invent lockdown games. And so they looked around their homes and they said, what could they find to make lockdown games with? And they then had to come up with the design. They had to make the design. They had to design the design, draw it out. They had to make the design, and then they had to do instructions, and then they had to video themselves, and then they had to look at the scale of what they'd done. And there was all sorts of things that came out of there, but it came from the kids by giving the kids, this is what we need to do. What ideas do you have about how we might address that? And I saw something very similar shared by somebody else recently, and I think sometimes we forget that flipping it to them might give us more ideas than we're struggling with ourselves.
Yeah, and I'll build on that a little. We were talking just yesterday with my bosses and such about what could be some of our focus for this year, and what we're looking at is an agency focus, but around goal setting, and setting goals for learning, carrying out that goal, evaluating, setting criteria for it, going through that whole process. And so as Kirsten just kind of described, it could be, I want to try to notice things in my environment that I haven't noticed before. So my goal this week is to notice as many different things that I haven't really noticed before, and then come back to me and talk, and it's again, creating that inquiry process alive in the kid, and getting them to see that, but also teaching them how to set a goal and to work toward meeting that goal. And what did you specifically do to notice, and how might you have done that differently? And so you're bringing in the observational skills and so on. All those pieces together, I think are wonderful, and so we're really looking at that agency through goal setting piece. For MYP, PYP, everybody this year. That's going to be our lens.
I think that's so important, and I love that the fact that the PYP with enhancements is really focused on goal setting against success criteria, because I think it's one thing to make goals, but what are you measuring it against, and where's your evidence there, right? And that's been such a powerful, just for me as an adult learner, of okay, well, how am I'm going to create these wonderful goals, but how am I going to measure myself against those goals, and what are my targets, and I think that's a game changer in this process. Thank you so much. Do you guys have any last tips or tricks that you'd love to share that have worked for you before we end?
I think engaging parents in this process, because a lot of families want workbooks and something easy that their kids can do because they can see progress and they can give answers to. So ensuring that our messaging and our communication out to our families is clear. If we're doing like inquiry notebooks, like what is a see, think, wonder? Are we being communicative and ensuring that parents understand the values of goal setting, as you were mentioning? And so I think that's a huge importance, because having kids at home is not easy. Having kids around you while you're trying to do work is not easy. And so that agency is where it comes in, and how we foster that and support that and show the benefit of is important, I think.
I think also just remembering to build in that reflection time, even if you can't do it as a group, that you always build it in and allow that a point to connect. So just asking the kids again, what skills do you think you use, or what connections have you made here, or and helping them to make statements like, I was a thinker when I used my critical thinking skills to analyze the math problem, so that they're making those connections and they're embedding it for themselves, so that we're, through the reflection process, releasing it back to them again instead of trying to always control it.
Again, I think the usage of the language is really critical, at all times, but especially now, because I know that schools are afraid we're losing our PYP, we're losing, the IB, yada, yada, yada. But if they continuously use the language, and I just really want to enforce that over and over and over, reinforce that, then I think that helps, whether we're talking ATL skills, learner profile, key concepts, we use the words inquiry. I think it's incredibly important that we keep using those words and those terms.
My last thought would be to remember self-care, and student self-care, to think about breaks and things like that, opportunities for play, in some of your transitions between ideas and or work and such. And so just, don't lose sight of some of that just being a kid piece in there. And nobody deserves to sit in front of a screen for, 5 to 6 hours, without that. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. Sorry about the herd of dogs. I'm in a house full of dogs
I got
now.
one.
Went from 1 to 4, and any little squirrel sets them off. But this has been an excellent discussion. I think we've just really helped a lot of teachers as they're, reducing their anxiety and giving them some strategies to help them with the next year. So have a wonderful start to the school year. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the
Thank you, Lou.